It's a great welcome to this great audience, which masses is in line with the challenging facing British Jewry. Before I announce Professor Wagner, about his background, we have another lecture coming. Dr. Simon Erlanger has lectured here a couple of times on Switzerland as a pioneer in the European Islam debate and the consequences for the Jews in Europe, because Switzerland certainly has become really the leader in limiting the variety of activities of Islam in the public sphere and other activities, and he'll explain why only Switzerland can fulfill that role in Europe. Well, the challenging facing British Jewry, we have published on that various authors in the course of time, Robert Wistrich, Michael Wein. We get it today from a very, very different point of view. Professor Wagner has been active as far as I can remember, at least 45 years in British Jewish life. From the time when he was chairman of the British Jewish Student Union, the IOJF. He's vice chairman of our Institute for Jewish Global Affairs. He is in charge of the research program and oversees the work of the interns. He's an editor of the Jewish Political Studies Review. He's a member of the board of NGO Monitor and Pardes. He was the Chancellor of the University of Derby. Before then was the president of two other universities in Britain. He was appointed to establish the Higher Education Academy to improve teaching standards in higher education. If I continue to read, there is no time for the lecture, so I will ask Leslie to start.
I always feel very tired when somebody reads out my story. Thank you, Manfred. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I see some friendly faces, and I'm sure they'll be friendly in an hour's time or so. In essence, the challenges facing British Jewry now are a little different to those which have faced Diaspora Jewry generally over the last 100 years or more. Namely, the twin problems of assimilation and anti-Semitism. Simple analysis says there's a close connection. The more anti-Semitism, the less assimilation. Either because marginal Jews are reminded why they're who they are, or they get fed up and move to Israel. But this is a very simple analysis, and I want to go obviously beyond that, because it seems to me the interesting questions today are whether the nature and context of these challenges are different now in the second decade of the 21st century, and how effective the community's response to these challenges is likely to be. So it's really the nature and context of the challenges. So let's begin with assimilation, reflected in such issues as numbers, commitment and identity. How many Jews are there in Britain? Well, if we were a group of demographers, we could spend the next hour and a half, probably the whole day, arguing about it and still not reach a conclusion. It's safe, I think, to claim that the figure is at least 300,000. Based on the comprehensive data from the UK 2001 UK census. Those of you who want to discuss and to study that data further should look at this publication, Jews in Britain, a snapshot from the 2001 census published by the Institute of Jewish Policy Research, and that was published in 2007. Now, as the authors of that report, who are very well established and distinguished social researchers in Anglo-Jewry, as they point out, given that the people in the census self-identified as Jews, and we don't know the extent of their Jewishness, and also given that different denominations within Judaism now have their own criteria for acceptance, there is no true figure for the number of Jews. It all depends on what you mean by Jews. At its height soon after the Second World War, most estimates put the size of the British Jewish community at around 450,000. So it would seem that the size of the community declined by up to a third in the second half of the 20th century. The major factors in this decline were the age structure of the community, with deaths growing faster than births, and assimilation. Not just intermarriage, but more and more people of Jewish descent not recognizing themselves as Jews. Aliyah is also a factor, but less than imagined, at least in terms of numbers. The quality is a different matter, but in terms of numbers, it's less than imagined because of the immigration of Jews into the UK over that period from places such as South Africa and, unfortunately, Israel. The actually net Yurida Aliyah is not that large. Now let me turn to another more recent report, also from the JPR, on synagogue membership. This is a report by them on synagogue membership published last year. Again, the methodology in these surveys is always open to criticism. In particular, it is difficult to obtain accurate data about the Haredi community, where the idea of membership of a shul is often an alien concept. People simply go to one shtibel or the other when they want to daven, and the notion of being a member of a shul and collecting membership fees and having records is quite difficult. However, there's a big methodology section to this report, and I believe the researchers have used the best possible methodology in obtaining data. And the results are fascinating. They look at the data. The data is actually from the end of 2008, and they do it by households. That is, any household where a member of the household joins a synagogue. And I just want to show you the figure that you don't have to look at in detail. That is a trend that you want to look at. They identified 82,000. If I get my laser right, this is 2000. Let's say 2010, but it's a 2008 figure. 82,000 households were members of synagogues, and they actually belong to 409 synagogues. So that's that line. And more interesting, of course, is the trend. And as you can see, there has been a decline over a 25-year period, 1983, 109,000 down to 82,000. And that's about 25% over a 25-year period. But what is also interesting is that the decline has been shallower in the last 10 years or so. Was heavy, become shallow. Between 1990 and 2001, membership declined by around 12%, or between 2001 and 2010, the decline was just over 5%. Now we come to the really interesting figures, the figures by denomination. I'll just give you a bit of time to absorb. I don't need to do all the figures, but let me just take you through them. Most obviously, Central Orthodoxy. This is defined as those, it's essentially the United Synagogue in London and other chief rabbis supporting synagogues outside London, and a small organisation called the Federation. We need to get to the details of Anglo-Jewish organisation, but essentially Central Orthodoxy is United Synagogue and other chief rabbi supporting organisations. And the figures there show that they have been hemorrhaging members since 1990. 66,000 has gone down to 45,000. So that's a third of their numbers over the last 20 years. But look at the other denominations, because they may be slightly counterintuitive to what you might think. The progressives have also, while not losing members, have hardly, reformers not gone up, gone down, and liberal had actually gone down as well. So I assume most of you know the distinction between these differences, but essentially the progressives. The Masorti has doubled, but on a very small base, from 1,026 to 2,269. But the really standout figure, as you can see, is the strictly Orthodox, who have more than doubled their numbers over this 20-year period. So that's the denominational picture. So simply put, the numerical picture is one of decline. Certainly outside the strictly Orthodox sector, and therefore clearly arresting that decline and strengthening the Jewish identity of its members is a major challenge for the leadership of British Jewry. It may be counterintuitive to everything you've seen so far, but I am going to argue that there is some evidence that the challenge is being met and that continuing sharp decline is not inevitable. Let's go back to the figures. You've seen the sharp decline for the last 20 years, including continuing but slower decline for the last 10 years, but now let me give you the figures for the last 5 years by denomination. Overall, the decline of, my fault. Overall, the decline has been arrested. The total change in synagogue membership there's been virtually no change in synagogue membership over the last 5 years. Central Orthodoxy continues to decline, but at a slower rate to what it did previously. The progressives show a small increase, but this is a decline in reform, an increase in the liberals, which the authors of the report certainly believe is due to the introduction of patrilineal descent by the liberal movement, accepting non-Jewish family with the non-Jewish fathers families with non-Jewish fathers as being Jewish. So their membership, they would regard those people, and not converting, these are straight non-Jews, they would regard those families, those people as Jewish. As again, the majority continue on their increase, but the standout figure again is the Orthodox, who are not only increasing, but it seems to be increasing at a faster rate. So those are the figures. I'm going to take your mind off the figures for a moment and get back to the narrative. I think we need have no fears about the Jewish identity of the strictly Orthodox community. However, the other sections of the community exist to offer more options than either being Haredi or assimilated. That's their raison d'etre. So the key to whether British Jewry can arrest its decline will be the performance of these other sections, and particularly the Central Orthodox communities. Even after its sharp decline over the last 20 years, Central Orthodoxy still attracts the majority of synagogue members. I could go back to about 3 slides back. Central Orthodoxy is still, on those figures, 54% of those Jews who affiliate to a synagogue. So of those who identify with a synagogue, over half still identify with Central Orthodoxy. Within Central Orthodoxy, there is a small group of synagogues known as the Federation, but the vast majority come under the aegis of the Chief Rabbi, some in the communities outside London, but most through an organisation called the United Synagogue, which covers Greater London and indeed out into the counties outside London, slightly on the periphery. I'm sure to Jews in the USA and Israel, the idea that the majority of affiliated Jews belong to a synagogue body which follows the Orthodox liturgy, which adheres to the norms of Orthodox halachic observance, but where probably less than 20% of the members follow an observant, even a non-observant lifestyle, must seem an anomaly. To supporters of the United Synagogue, the fact that it allows membership and indeed involvement to any halachic Jew without any Jewish observance requirements is its crowning glory, a testament to the inclusivity of Anglo-Jewish orthodoxy. Now, why the United Synagogue adheres to this policy is not difficult to understand. Ideologically, it provides a framework within which people might become more observant or at least strengthen their identity. Pragmatically, it enables orthodoxy to dominate Anglo-Jewish religious politics in a way that, for example, it does not do in the USA. What is more difficult to understand is why the majority of British Jewry, unlike their fellow Jews in the USA, continues to be comfortable with this approach. The mass of less observant, colloquially known as 3 days a year Jews, and you can guess which days those are, the mass of less observant Jews have long been recognised as the soft underbelly of the United Synagogue. While the first generation of British-born Jews, many generations ago now, might have been expected to stay loyal in membership, if not in practical observance, to the faith and synagogues of their parents, this effect might have been expected to wear off as the community moved on to its second and third generations, as has happened elsewhere. To some extent it has worn off, as the decline in membership, the third decline in membership shows. But it is still robust. There's still a robust, it is still the majority. Moreover, while it is difficult to trace the flows of people moving through the various denominations, there's some work now being done on this, I understand. It's where people go when they move from one denomination to the other in their time. The decline in the Central Orthodox numbers component has not been accompanied by any dramatic increase in the numbers in the progressive communities in recent decades. They haven't fallen, so not by as much as Orthodox, but they haven't gained membership. Indeed, it is the strictly Orthodox community which is growing, partly through its own high birth rates, of course, but also because as people who become more observant while in membership of the United Synagogue, or their children have experienced a year or more in yeshiva or seminary in Israel, they move from the United Synagogue into the more strictly Orthodox synagogue. So the movement, it is not a movement you might have thought. The strictly Orthodox continue to grow. It is not entirely a growth produced from within their own families and groups. After a major report into the future of the United Synagogue by a team led by Stanley Calms, now Lord Calms, at the start of the 1990s, the United Synagogue slowly began to reform itself in terms of its structures and purposes. It took more than a decade for these changes to be introduced, and it is at least a hypothesis worth testing that the lower fall in membership over recent years is in some part due to the changes that have been introduced slowly over the last decade or more. Apart from giving individual synagogues and their rabbis more autonomy, the main focus has been to emphasize community as much as synagogue. The stress is now on serving the whole needs of the community from birth to old age, and not just their religious needs. Jews may join their local synagogue for a variety of reasons, of which the religious facilities may be way down the list for some of them. So, having been an organisation that was a synagogue which provided a few other activities, I think the United Synagogue, and indeed the other denominations as well, are now moving into a mode where they are a community centre, which includes a whole range of services for people, of which services is important for those for whom it's important, but which it isn't the only reason that you join your synagogue. I leave out the question that the United Synagogue, most synagogues deal with the burial of their members, and the joke that you join the synagogue for when you die, not for when you live. But in terms of the positive areas, this has been a change about the sense of community and what it offers their people. And now I come to the Chief Rabbinate. Very unlike the Israeli Chief Rabbinate in many of its functions, and certainly in the qualities of its current incumbent, Lord Jonathan Sacks. The continuing controversy within British Jewry is the extent to which a Chief Rabbi, appointed by one section of the community, the Central Orthodox, can speak for the whole community. This was not a major issue under previous Chief Rabbis, partly because Central Orthodoxy was so dominant numerically. If you've done the percentage for 1990 when Sacks came in, Central Orthodoxy was closer to 70%, 55% of the community. And partly because in the past the outside world wasn't particularly interested in hearing a Jewish point of view. This began to change under Lord Saxe's predecessor, Emanuel Jacobowitz, but it is Saxe who has faced the major challenge to his right to speak for the whole community. So partly because he represents the declining section of the community, albeit the majority, and partly because the rest of the world wants to hear from him in a way they have not wanted to hear from previous chief rabbis. The quality of his writing and ideas has made him the first choice by media outlets for not just a Jewish point of view, but as a general religious voice on current issues. It is often not the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Roman Catholic Archbishop they go to, but the chief rabbi, for a general religious point of view, not just a Jewish point of view. He is ubiquitous in his media and public lecture presence, and constant references to the chief rabbi is more than irritating to the progressive denominations. This is not assuaged when it is pointed out that Saxe does not invite himself to appear in the media, but responds to invitations, many of which he turns down. Inside the community, Saxe has been involved in major controversies in his dealings with the other Jewish denominations, despite an explicit desire to promote inclusivity. These controversies have been described in detail by Mayor Persoff in his book, Another Time, Another Way, which unfortunately, Mayor, I have to say, I regard a flawed analysis of a complex issue, and I'm happy to say why that is later. But Persoff in his book calls for Saxe to be the last chief rabbi, and this has been echoed by others, most recently, as I'm sure some of you have read, Shmuley Boter in the Jerusalem Post. It is curious to me that the longer people have been separated from British Jewry, the more confident they feel in telling it what to do. Saxe has announced his retirement at the age of 65 in 2013, and the United Synagogue and its fellow communities are planning to start the process for appointing his successor later this year. There may well be voices within the United Synagogue itself which also raise the question of the need for a chief rabbi, but these will largely be on the grounds of cost. My view is it's doubtful if these voices, both inside and outside the US, will prevail. It is perhaps not well known that over a third of the funding of the Chief Rabbinate comes from private donations rather than communal funds. This provides an annual market test of the value of the Chief Rabbinate. It seems to me that hard-nosed business people are unlikely to continue funding the activities of the Chief Rabbinate if they don't feel it is providing value for their money. A more interesting question is whether Central Orthodoxy can find a new chief rabbi that will inspire the community to strengthen its Jewish identity and commitment. So it's not whether there will be a chief rabbi, but what sort of chief rabbi will be appointed, and that remains to be seen, and really does remain to be seen. I want to move away now from the established community to look at a few other current issues. The research of Stephen Cohen is well known in this institute. Indeed, here early in this year he spoke in this room and subsequently in an interview with Manfred Gerstenfeld about the greater engagement of young American Jews searching for Jewish purpose in their lives. And this was reflecting the creation of new minyanim, expanded social justice activities, various cultural activities, and greater Jewish learning. In other words, away from the established set of belonging to a synagogue and doing all that, other ways of manifesting your Jewish identity. Well, Stephen actually covered the same issues in a lecture in the UK at the beginning of last year, where there's much evidence of a similar phenomenon to that in the USA occurring. New minyanim of younger people are springing up. Even the established synagogues in main areas of population now offer a variety of minyanim from hashkama to late and from participatory to easy learning, something not very evident a decade or more ago. And this continues to flourish in the UK. So much so that it's now being studied. In his interview with Manfred, Stephen mentioned the greater openness to learning, particularly among younger Jews. Well, Britain is where the leading international brand of open Jewish learning, Limud, began and where it continues to flourish, with over 2,000 people attending the annual flagship residential conference over the Christmas period. This is a phenomenal number, for the community size of Britain, and the size is often limited not by the numbers wanted to come, but by the size of the venue available over the Christmas period, which is when it's held. Finally, looking at how the community is meeting the challenge of assimilation, we must turn to the remarkable changes taking place in Jewish schooling. Leaving aside for the moment the strictly Orthodox community, between 1995 and 2005, the number of children attending Jewish schools in London increased by 40%. Between 1995 and 2005, now it was a small base, 40% isn't important, but it wasn't that small a base, increased by 40%. I exclude the strictly Orthodox because close to 100% of their children attend Jewish schools, and growth there is a function of the birth rate rather than resulting from choice. So let's look at and also they're a group, as I said before, less vulnerable to assimilation, but I will include them back in a moment. Let's look at the non-strictly Orthodox. In 2005, it was estimated that outside the strictly Orthodox group, between 45 and 50% of Jewish children attended Jewish schools. As a result of continued growth over the last 5 years, we now have well over 60% of non-Haredi Jewish children in Jewish schools, and the numbers continue to grow.
To what level?
Sorry?
To secondary level?
Primary and secondary. Primary, there's not much difference. I've got the figures, but it's primary. I'll come to it. Primary is being constrained by the capacity. Secondary isn't. Haredi children currently make up around 33% of Jewish children. You have to change it every 2 years or so because it goes up. So if you take this into account, we now have Haredi and non-Haredi children, something close to 75% of all Jewish children in London now attending Jewish schools. Indeed, as I was saying, there is a clear shortage of places in the primary sector as supply struggles to keep up with a burgeoning demand. Part of the increase in the primary sector certainly is due to a rise in birth rates over the last few years. It affects actually the whole of society in Britain. It's not something that observes in Jewish birth, so let's leave the Haredim out. There seems to be the demographic curve is turning upwards again. But it's also due, I think the birth rate is a small factor, it's also due in my view to what I would describe as a cultural shift, producing increased demand for both primary and secondary schooling. Secondary schooling, although demand is growing, there is no shortage of places because as a result of uncoordinated expansion, there has been a 50% increase in the number of places available in Jewish secondary schools in the last 5 years. Capacity has gone up by 50%, 2 new schools and expansion of at least 1 existing school. The increase in numbers in the secondary sector, while impressive, has not yet matched the growth in overall capacity. There are still spare places, which, if we get a talk on Jewish schooling, would take me down a different route of the implications of that. Although even in the secondary sector, popular schools still cannot meet demand. But in the sector as a whole, there are places. One of the reasons for the cultural shift which I mentioned earlier is that Jewish schools regularly feature among the top performing schools in the country in academic education. Secular education in the UK is funded by the state, and that includes Jewish schools that are within the state system. So from a parent's point of view, if you are going to send your child to a state-funded school, and not a private school, then on educational grounds, alone the Jewish school is the best option. At the secondary level, there is also the consideration that non-Jewish schools will be more mixed in terms of their social class, ethnic origins and ability levels. And that's a reason why parents are again moving, where they're going for state education, to Jewish schools. However, undoubtedly another reason for the attitudinal shift, and this is being confirmed by surveys that are being done in the last year or two by those running these schools, another reason is that parents, most of whom are not regular synagogue attendees, see the schools as a partial antidote to assimilation, whether this be through the formal curriculum of Judaism, Jewish history and Zionism, or the informal curriculum of being in a Jewish atmosphere and mixing with other Jewish children. There has been and will continue to be much debate about whether Jewish schools do act as an antidote to assimilation. Again, that's a subject of another talk. I can't go down that route today. But whatever the arguments are, Jewish parents certainly believe that they are an antidote to assimilation and provide things that they cannot provide for their children at home. So the continuing rise in enrolment of Jewish kids in Jewish schools is again, I think, one of the hopeful signs of the community investing in its future. So now let me put assimilation aside, I'll summarise at the end, and let me turn to the other issue of anti-Semitism. The deep roots of anti-Semitism in British cultural life have recently been documented by Anthony Julius in his book Trials of the Diaspora, and by Robert Wistrich in an article in our own post-Holocaust anti-Semitism series in 2009. In a recent lecture here, Simcha Epstein explained how the current wave of anti-Semitism in Europe is different from previous waves, both in its length and its provenance, coming from an unholy alliance of left-wing and jihadist Islamic factions rather than exclusively from the right. Melanie Phillips, of course, in her book Londonistan, published in 2005, was the first to point out how London had become home for the most extreme Islamic leaders from across the world. In recent weeks we've had two more publications, one from the Reut Institute and another one from here at the JCPA by Ehud Rosen, which have analysed how London has become the centre for the campaign for the delegitimization of Israel. And to keep us bang up to date, only last week the police announced that among the targets of alleged terrorists whom they arrested in London, there were two synagogues and their rabbis. If we add to this catalogue other well-known anti-Israel actions in Britain, from pioneering the idea of academic boycotts, to the BDS resolutions of the Methodist churches in June last year, to the use of universal jurisdiction to threaten visiting Israelis, it is not difficult to conclude that the forces of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are deeply embedded and growing in Britain. Take that as our starting point. The key question for discussion here today is, how does this affect British Jewry, and how does it react to it, and what are the consequences? Well, the data on anti-Semitic incidents in the UK is collected by an organisation called the Community Security Trust, the CST, which is the tasked within the community with fighting anti-Semitism. And here is its report. Here's its report on the incidents. They collect incidents each year. I'll come to other figures in a moment. Here is its report on the first half of the 3 years, 2008, 2009, 2010, and you see there that we have a figure of 277 in 2008, 628 in 2009, and 310 in 2010. And it doesn't take a genius to link that change to the Gaza war, and as they do, because they actually within the report analyse it month by month, compared with the time series, and you can see that in the Gaza war months of 2009, January and February particularly, the number of incidents shot up, and then eventually went back to whatever is normal, but to the figures of previous years.
Are they all half year? Yes.
These are all half years. I'm putting on the board. This is so they can show the half year figures.
Yeah, okay.
And the increase, the increase in 2010, June is Gaza flotilla a month. And again, looking at the different incidents month by month, they analyse that in fact, if you take 277 as what it was and the figures are back, most of this increase they attribute to those two, the effect in Britain of those two incidents. I will now go on to the annual figures, which I've produced from their report. These are the annual total incidents between 2004 and 2009, but again, you can see that the number of incidents between 204 and 208 vary between 450. Oh, sorry. Between 204 and varied. There's some evidence that remember 206 was Lebanon war year, but whether I haven't gone down to analyse that. But essentially, we're talking about, again, 209 shows the impact of Gaza, but essentially trying to get some norm of how many instances there are and what an instance is, as we'll come to in a moment. We're somewhere between 450 or around 500 to 600.
How do you define incident? Only physical or
no, I'm about
someone who calls and makes
I'm about to give you the answer. It's both. The most common form of anti-Semitism is abusive behaviour. So that is name-calling or shouting or abusive behaviour to Jews, either individually or as a group. The next one is physical assault. They include assault. I mean, they include the whole lot. I haven't got reports on my computer, but it's a comprehensive report that includes, as I say, physical abuse, verbal abuse, physical assault, and including, they say, in most years, in a handful of cases, the assault is classified as extreme violence. 2 or 3 cases a year which end. 1 or 2 have been life-threatening over the last years, but it ranges from, I think, casual abuse of somebody in a passing car shouting abuse at a group of Jews in the street, to somebody physically attacking a Jew or Jews, causing them physical harm. And in some cases, what we regard as extreme violence, which ends with people in hospital. But that's, they say, less than a handful. So, this catalogue of more than 10 incidents a week in a normal year, and over 50 a week in the Gaza months of January and February 2009, does not make pleasant reading, nor, I assume, were they, of course, pleasant experiences for those subject to them. Now, the CST augments its report on incidents with an annual discourse report, which is a very interesting report. It's a long report, about 60 pages, which analyses written and verbal communication, discussion and rhetoric about Jews and Jewish-related issues, often, usually in the media, but from wherever source they can get them. And again, that doesn't make very pleasant reading, because there are graphic pictures of what people are writing and saying, as well as analysing it. And this covers familiar territory to most people in this room, discussing in some depth, among other matters, how issues such as anti-Zionism and anti-Zionism are discussed, the Gaza war, the comparison between the Holocaust and Gaza, the Jewish lobby, and other such matters, how these are played out in the media and other cultural forums. And so that is not that's a qualitative report, not a quantitative report. It actually picks out what it's doing. So the question is, besides reporting and drawing attention to these incidents, what has been the community's response to these threats? One aspect we shouldn't be forgetting is the protection provided by the CST to communal buildings, events and senior figures, which is a very comprehensive exercise and is almost largely successful. Clearly buildings are attacked because they don't provide 24-hour watch to every Jewish building. But it is a comprehensive protection system. The community's leadership, I believe, would also argue that it is well connected and influential politically at the most senior levels of government and parliament, reflected, for example, in regular strong statements from the Prime Minister downwards and the work of the Parliamentary Committee on Anti-Semitism. The relationship with the police is strong. Holocaust education remains a firm part of the school curriculum, with an increasing number of visits to Auschwitz and other concentration camps by school parties. These are non-Jewish children across the country. So I think the community would claim, and I would have some sympathy with this claim, that the fight against classical anti-Semitism is undoubtedly well organised. And the community has a robust set of partnerships and networks in place. It has been more uncertainty. I thought a long time about the use of that word, but I think the word I would use is uncertainty. Other people might use stronger words. There has been more uncertainty, however, in the community's approach to the new anti-Semitism, led by this unholy alliance of the political left and militant Islam. In part, this is because, like the rest of British society, the Jewish community has been slow to recognise the significance of this threat. Its historical attitude to its relationship with other faiths being to accentuate the positive rather than the negative. The tardiness of general British society's response to radical Islam, even after the attacks of July 2005, has been well documented by Melanie Phillips and subsequently by others. At the security level within British society, the response has been strong, with many alleged attacks being thwarted, the latest being last week. But at the political level, there has been a lack of focus, because its approach to others. At the political level, there's been a lack of focus. The Jewish community has shared this lack of focus because its approach to the faith has long been one of interfaith dialogue, based essentially on the reconciliation and friendship with Christians following the Holocaust. As Muslims became more prominent, the adaptation of this model to Islam followed, with free faiths forums and so on being established. Increasing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish comments by some Muslims and regular terror threats have resulted in the community seeking to distinguish between good Muslims and bad Muslims. The discourse for report for 209, for example, focuses far more, and actually probably correctly, on the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish writings of leftist journalists, commentators, authors and playwrights, of which there is a plethora, than it does on the Muslims. Actually, in fact, one of the few references to Muslims in the 209 report is a reference to a letter that was sent by the imams of a group of imams in London to 1,000 mosques during the Gaza war, telling them to separate their views about what was going on in Gaza from the attitude to Jews, and they should not attack Jews. I mean, that's both typical of the way a community would deal with Muslims, say, let's accentuate the positive side of Muslims, but also pointing out, again, that there were groups within the community that are seeking to work together with Muslims. But largely they have tried to separate good Muslims from bad Muslims. The community's leadership has protested, often successfully, against the entry of radical imams to the UK, and more recently has been showing increasing concern on what is happening to Jewish students on campus. Remarkably, because he usually avoids strong language, it is the Chief Rabbi who has most recently articulated this concern. At the government ceremony to mark a report on anti-Semitism, this was a few weeks ago, he condemned events at the LSE a few weeks earlier, London School of Economics a few weeks earlier, in which Jewish students had been attacked and intimidated, and said, quote, "This has been going on for over a decade. The inflammatory public speeches being allowed to take place on university campuses would in any other context and directed against any other group be prosecuted under the law." He accused the university authorities of turning a blind eye and a deaf ear, and urged the government to pressure the university to take action. It remains to be seen whether this is an isolated comment by a communal leader, or whether it is the start of a sustained, more proactive campaign, not just to defend students, but to confront specifically and vigorously leftist Islamic anti-Semitism. The increasing Israel-centred nature of anti-Semitism in the UK inevitably raises the question of the community's relationship to Israel. This has recently been in the headlines, as you know, because of the remarks of Mick Davis, a senior communal leader and chairman of the UJIA, but the issue has been a source of tension for some years. I don't know if you're disappointed or not, but it's not my purpose here to comment on what Mick Davis actually said, but rather to try to throw some light rather than heat, I hope, on the general issue of British Jewry's current relationship with Israel. In the early decades of its existence, probably until sometime after 1973 war, Israel was a unifying factor in diaspora life. Now it is a source of division both within the diaspora communities and between the diaspora and Israel. And this is reflected in the first survey of British Jewry's attitude to Israel for nearly 15 years, published by, again, I don't know how I've done this talk without them, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. This is a report that they published 6 months ago. Committee concerning the attitudes of Jews in Britain towards Israel. I'm going to give you the findings of this research. Again, I believe the methodology is as good as it can be, and there's some interesting results here. So what do we find? On the one hand, there is a strong identification with Israel. 95% have visited. This is a remarkable figure, but it's contested by other ways. 95% have visited. 87% agree that Jews have a responsibility for the survival of Israel. 82% think Israel plays a central and important role in their Jewish identity. 77% believe that Jews have a special responsibility to support Israel, meaning, from the question, the state, not the policies of any particular government. And 72% consider themselves as Zionists. I've gone down from the highest to the lowest, but it's the same figures as you have with one or two others. When it comes to particular Israeli policies, the results are more varied. So 78% favour a two-state solution, 67% favour giving up territory for peace, and 52% favour negotiations with Hamas. Of course, as in all surveys, not all the responses are necessarily mutually consistent, because we don't know what is going on in people's heads when they're answering the questions. They just answer the question. It's not a qualitative survey. You can't then say, well, what you said here doesn't seem to conflict what you said there. So as you can read, 72% think the security barrier is vital for Israel's security. 55% consider Israel an occupying final territories, but 50% consider control of the West Bank is vital for Israel's security. I suppose it's possible to hold both those simultaneously. Now, but the key for what I want to say and what we've been talking about is something on the crucial question of whether it is correct to criticise. It's correct to criticise Israel. I want to just look at that particular response. Essentially, the community is split. 35% yes, say yes, it is correct to criticise Israel in public. 25% say never, and 38% say sometimes. So when we come to look at the community's leadership's position, it seems to me the relevant question here is whether the community's leadership should reflect this division of opinion or stay publicly supportive of Israel policy in all circumstances. In the past, the leadership's silence on some Israeli controversies was interpreted in some quarters as cowardice, the trembling Israelites charge. Well, knowing many of these leaders, the last thing I would ever accuse them of is cowardice and trembling. It might just be the case. In the past, these leaders decided that silence was the best approach when it came to Israeli policies or actions that they felt their community were ambivalent about. Mick Davis's recent remarks may indicate that that attitude may now be changing, and indeed he set out his own views earlier last year, before his actual comments in November. In an article in the Jewish Chronicle in June last year, his view was clearly expressed in the headline that the Jewish Chronicle put on his article, which was, "Open debate is our best way of defending Israel in the diaspora." It's a succinct expression without going into the article itself. It remains to be seen whether British Jewish leaders, faced with difficult Israeli policies or actions, publicly support Israel, remain silent, or begin to articulate what they think is good for Israel even if it's different from that of the Israeli government. And that is another challenge that they face at this moment, and Israel faces in discussing it with them. Finally, the CST, in its discourse report, while reporting on the various attacks on Jews and Israel, also makes a very interesting comment as follows: anti-Semitism does not prevent Jews from living a full life as British citizens. Anti-Semitism does not prevent Jews from living a full life as British citizens. This is undoubtedly true, as testified by the many Jews who have and continue to occupy the highest positions in British political, business, financial and cultural life. Moreover, these are not the court Jews of medieval times who were indulged in only when they were useful. Nor are they secret Jews hiding their identity. Not many may be religious, but they recognize their Jewish identity, and most are involved in Jewish community activities. I believe it's safe to say that Jews in Britain do not yet, perhaps, but do not yet feel themselves to be a beleaguered minority. So, I'm going to summarise what I've said about the challenges and responses facing British Jewry. Well, assimilation will certainly continue. The numbers will continue to fall. The next census, which takes place actually in March this year, but it will take 2 or 3 years for the results to come out, will undoubtedly show a further fall in the number of people defining themselves as Jews. What the number will be, there have been forecasts on the basis of intermarriage rates and so on, but that's guesswork. There is some hope that the community's actions, through the changing roles of its synagogues, increasing Jewish school enrollment, the new approaches to Jewish learning, and the richer Jewish experiences of its young people, may slow the decline. The viability and vitality of Jewish life in the major centres will undoubtedly continue for many years to come, but in the other areas, which currently are about 25% of the, London, if you take Manchester, which is the other strong, vibrant sector, partly because of the Haredi community, together they make up about 80-ish% of the community. So in the 20% that's outside the two areas, there will undoubtedly be decline, but communities are robust and resilient, and it's a long time, as Mark Twain said, the reports of their death are often exaggerated by decades before they actually come, but they are on the road of decline. But in London and Manchester, I believe the viability and vitality of Jewish life will continue. The Haredi community will be larger in both numbers and as a percentage of the community. The central challenge in terms of assimilation for the rest of the community is to show that a Jewish lifestyle, which is not strictly orthodox, can ensure Jewish continuity. That remains the challenge for the rest of the community. As for anti-Semitism, the community is well organised to fight classic anti-Semitism, but has been less sure-footed with the new anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Zionism. This remains a major challenge, and there are some signs that the more outspoken and more proactive approach which is needed is now being adopted. As for the challenge of the changing relationship between British Jewry and Israel, this will continue to be a lively, passionate, and unfortunately sometimes ugly debate, both within the community and more widely. Recently, those of you who attend frequently at the Institute seminars will have heard gloomy prognostications about European Jewry and the claim that it has no future. I suppose it partly depends on what time frame you're speaking about. I'm not sure if the future is tomorrow, next week, next decade, next 50 years, or what. You have to define your time frame. And anyway, I'm not a futurologist. But I do believe that while British Jewry will continue to be buffeted by the twin assaults of assimilation and anti-Semitism, it is robust enough to withstand those assaults for many years to come. Thank you.
Online questions, I'll read them out, the people out. Easy Liebler, Ambassador Tzvi Mazel, Sharon Shenhafai, John Welcome, Dr. Malcolm Lowe, Dr. Maimon, Judge Bach, and Rabbi Mahat. I just want to say one thing. I have a lot to say because I've looked into the same phenomena in the Netherlands recently. I don't believe any incidents really. I'll just give you one simple example of this week. I interview a Haredi, well, not even very Haredi Jew, somebody who wears a kippah, lives here, has worked, come to here a year and a half from the Netherlands. He worked in a supermarket close to Amsterdam's main square. He says he was insulted or harassed 2 or 3 times a week. He worked there for a year. That are 100 to 120 incidents of that one single person in that supermarket. All, by the way, all by Moroccans, who represent 2% of the population. And different Moroccans. Particularly bad on Moroccan holidays, on religious Muslim holidays. Okay, I say to him, I'm not speaking about his other incidents. When he went to the synagogue in Rotterdam, where he was regularly attacked with others, and when he went to a synagogue in Amsterdam West. Of none of these incidents he has ever reported a single one. So what are we talking about? I'm seeing another Haredi person who came on aliyah from the Netherlands, and I know that his story. Perhaps he didn't work in a supermarket, so he couldn't create the same quantity of incidents, but we are still speaking about very, very substantial numbers, and he has reported on some, and there is a third one who left for Antwerp, who I also am going to get the address of. So if we start looking at the, so that is the side of the incidents. The head of the Dutch seminary has given reports to interviews to the newspapers recently. He no longer uses the public tramway. Now, of course, if you don't use the public tramway, the number of your incidents you are faced with in the public tramway goes down to 0. He also goes rarely on the street, or he avoids going on the street as much as he can. His son, who goes on television with him and says, I'm not going to show my face, I'm already harassed at university enough, and I am leaving next year. With his departure, all the harassments in the future of that person will not take place because he will live here. So you get a whole picture which says, sure, anti-Semitic incidents will go down in the Netherlands in future because the people who can be most harassed, those identifiable, are the ones who are living in far bigger percentages than anybody else in the community. So this whole incident issue has never been properly assessed. I'll not comment on anything else. Okay, if we do 3 rounds of 3 people, as we usually do. Easy Liebler, Ambassador Tzvi Mazel, Sharon Shenhafai. Easy, do we have...
Yes. Thank you. I think I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of us did. It was a fascinating introduction to aspects that I was unaware of. I'd like to ask you 2 questions and make 1 observation. One, a very simple question. I'm always confused between the different progressive groups. Could you just break them down, those 3, and explain what they are? The second one, which I think is terribly important, is the discussion you had about the Jewish day school movement. What makes England unique? And I know that in Australia we also have a fantastic Jewish day school movement, but unlike England, there is not state aid to any large extent. That is the revolution. That is what I think Jewish diaspora communities should be striving for. And could you explain exactly how it works, the distinction between the secular and the religious, and where the state funds come in? And the third aspect a few comments, if I may, on the anti-Semitism. I think that the survey that you displayed shows one thing. Anglo-Jews are still Zionist, are still pro-Israel, and still feel very Jewish. I think that the same thing applies in the United States. The surveys that were shown in the United States showed that despite all the noise of the far left and the people who are ultra-critical of Israel, the overall feeling is one still of strong support for Israel, and it's the liberal media that has played up the minority groups and created a distorted impression. Now, where I am very, very critical of Anglo-Jewry is not the people, but the leadership. Because whether we talk about trembling Israelites, and you may be right, it's not a question of trembling Israelites, or whether we're talking about not rocking the boat, there is an attitude, and I can testify to that because I've been a leader in the Jewish community, and I know the sort of problems they face. There is an unwillingness to face up and stand up to governments on unpopular issues such as Israel. There is, I would say, I call it cowardice. You would deny that, but it could also be rationalized as we whisper, as one of the presidents said, rather than shout. My view is that they have absolutely had no influence whatsoever on their government, and they have also not demonstrated to their own constituents unless they were pressed to speak up for Israel. In contrast to Crif and French Jewry, who have been much more aggressive, not much more successful, but at least they could say that they tried and they spoke up and it made up. The other thing I would like to make as an observation is I fully endorse Manfred's. I was going to but they do show a trend. So you have a few more bashings or a few more epithets. But the real issue is, and here I say that many Anglo-Jews are in denial. I do not think they appreciate the extent and the depths of anti-Semitism in that country. And the depths of anti-Semitism in that country are reflected in the media. And if you pick up the media today and compare it to the media 10 or 15 years ago, or look, better still, at the talkbacks, which are always shrill and high-pitched, you will get an image of anti-Semitism in that country, which I would suggest is worse than it was in the 1930s. Not as dangerous because we don't have a Hitler, and God forbid we're not facing genocide, but worse in the sense that in those days we had the progressives and the left and even the communists were defending us. Nobody, hardly anybody defends us except a very small minority. And my view is that there is, when you say there is a great future, no, you didn't say that. When you say that the future of Anglo-Jewry is assured, it may be well, all right, whatever, the more positive aspect of what you said. I feel that to live in Anglo-Jewry today, the way things are today, and the way things I believe are going to become worse, is to live a pariah existence. That is a very difficult thing for a normal Jew.
Thank you very much for your talk. There are some problems, just as our friend just said. First of all, I cannot accept the sentence about Jews in England live fully their Jewishness. Absolutely, it's impossible. Given what you said, it's impossible. I mean, I don't know how many Jews, when they go out, take off their kippah, or they cover their Magen David.
You haven't got it on in the first place.
So, listen, you should really study this problem and see what are the results. It's just there is a internal contradiction in your speech. A second thing, I would like to know what is the role of the Israelis, leftist people who live there. They are quite important as we see them from Israel. And what is their role in the community? How do they affect the community? Thank you.
Last one in this round, Sharon.
Yes, I wanted to ask you to discuss the Chief Rabbi's study of the role of women in Jewish community, which was done about 20 years ago, or about 18 years ago. That study was done by Roz Preston and a large staff of professionals all over the UK. Many recommendations were published. My understanding is that almost none of them have been implemented, and I wondered if you thought that had an effect on the decline of membership in the United Synagogue and the decline or the increase of assimilation, because we all know that there is a lack of equality for women in the Orthodox establishment in the UK.
I'm tempted to take as long answering the questions as I did in making the speech, because they're fascinating questions. Too easy. Well, short answer, which there are other people in the audience can give it. There are, unlike the USA, there are three denominations in Britain: Reform, Liberal and Masorti. The nearest I can get it is that Masorti is close to the American Conservative movement. Reform and Liberal between them would cover the Reform movement in the USA, without going into the theology or the issues, except that I would think some Reform, because they came out of a slightly different historical tradition, some Reform synagogues would be quite close to the Conservative, because these are wide umbrella movements. You can have very many different forms of religious practice, but for example, in the Conservative movement, small Masorti, you have traditional services with men and women separate in some synagogues, and egalitarian services with them together, and indeed in the same building there's two services going on depending on which one you fancy. Most of the Reform, as far as I know, are mixed seating and more English in the service, but they are moving back in what you've read. The Liberals were the most radical, and the Liberals, I think the main difference is, as I understand it, that the Liberals were the smallest group, as you can see, in a sense don't have any second recognised religious authority, I'll put it that way. They do agree on paternal, for example, the patrilineal descent was agreed by the rabbis, but in a sense their view is that you practice, in a sense, what is meaningful to you. But essentially, and they split for historical reasons, they're actually now part of something called the progressive community. So for many political, and there are people who can speak better than me about this, for many political issues within the community, they work together. They are still formally separate organisations, but essentially Masorti is conservative and on that. Again, on the education, I did have a section here explaining that, but then it obviously took too long, so I took it out. Essentially, and it's changing now because we have a new government and it has many news, but essentially in Britain you are allowed, unlike the USA, you are allowed to have faith schools. This because essentially the British education system was actually started by the Church of England. Mm-hmm. They were the first people in the 19th century to provide regular schooling for people. So the idea of faith schools has always been accepted. And Jewish schools, when they were established, well, the JFS has been going for 2 centuries or more, but most Jewish schools started off in the Second World War. Many sought to get state recognition. And if they got state recognition, and I have a figure in my briefcase about this, majority of them, what that means is that most of your capital building, essentially, mostly, and all your secular education is provided free. The only thing that has to be found by the parents are the costs of the Jewish studies, tuition, and security. Though in fact there was an announcement about 3 or 4 weeks ago that the government has now recognised that security of Jewish buildings should fall on the government and on the Jewish community. Having said, wow, yeah, I know from the study I undertook 2 or 3 years ago that even those fees, which amount in sterling terms for most parents between £1,000 and £2,000 a year, are difficult to collect, because what the state will not allow you to do is make it compulsory. It has to be a voluntary donation. So, because schooling is free. If you go to a free school, it's free. You can ask parents to contribute to certain things, like Jewish studies, but DAFCA if they don't want to. So there is a problem, believe it or not, even with free education. But you're right. So that's the essential of it. And now with the new Conservative government, they're trying to encourage more people to set up schools. They've established the idea of what they call, I think, free schools, which is that you can start, if a group of parents want to come and start a school with state support, they can. The snag is that you have to allow, if you start a faith school, you've got to allow up to 50% non-faith participants, which is an issue. So that's that. On your comments, I accept. I agree with you. I mean, I think the numbers are numbers. I have no other anecdotal stuff where you meet somebody who says that they're not going somewhere. I mean, the figures are the figures. I don't think the CST hide them, but maybe not everybody reports them. But as I say, it's the trend, and I was really showing that to show. What I was really showing those figures to show is, and it comes back to part of what you were saying, that there is a strong Israel focus background to when anti-Semitism rises in the UK, and whether it's this level going up to there or this level going up to there, it's actually where it's going up. There's the counter, and that affects, though I didn't get into that, how British Jewry and British Jewish leaders deal with the issue of Israel. To me, I did not say, first of all, I didn't say it. It was the CST that said it, but it did not say full life as Jews. What it said was, anti-Semitism does not prevent Jews from living a full life as British citizens, not as Jews. They didn't say that. So that's what I said. I hope that's what I said, because that's what's written down here. For the life as British, in other words, they're not inhibited from achieving what positions they want to achieve in British society by being Jews. No doubt there is. Of course, there is anti-Semitism. All those who lived in Britain for any number of years know it exists. The question is, British Jews may have a slightly different attitude to it to those who don't live in Britain, live in Israel, and that's their prerogative, not for me to say. I no longer live there. The Israeli left is probably more prominently seen in Israel than it is in Britain. The Israeli left in Britain is more probably publicised in Israel. That is, the Jerusalem Post will spot it when it happens, usually for the English language readers, than people in Britain would spot it. They're mainly focused, obviously, in the universities. There are some prominent Israelis. The guy behind the universal jurisdiction battle is an Israeli lawyer who lived in Britain for many years. I'm coming. I'm talking about. Hold on. I said many universities. I've got to universities. I said I'm talking about outside universities, like the lawyers. Inside the universities, there are many. Avi Shleim has been out of Israel longer than he's been in Israel, so he's an Israeli, but he's actually. You should take the responsibility of him. I'm not sure anymore. And these people are part of a group that are with, as I said, are part of a leftist group. They give credence to the leftist group because they're Israelis. It's not for me to say, because I'm out of England now and I've been out for 2 or 3 years. I think they're not the driving force. They are the fig leaf. They are what many would call.
They don't affect the thinking of the Jews in England. No,
not in my view. We have to ask people. There are people who live in England. No, they don't. They are the fig leaf, or as Lenin would have called them, useful idiots, for the leftist causes. They provide them with some legitimation for the views they would have anyway. When I lived in England, for example, Ilan Pape occasionally says things and does things, but compared to what lots of other people are saying and doing, it isn't that. But that's my judgment. There are other people. I'm willing for other people to make a contribution there. They're there. They're irritants. They annoy. You wish they weren't there. They add credence to what the left is saying. But if the left weren't saying anyway, they would not have an audience. That's the point. They don't initiate it. They provide the support for it. Although they initiate it first, but the fact is, there's a much stronger within, as Epstein did and others have done, and indeed the book from Epstein, video game, sorry, goes into. It's a very. I have to give a publicity to that because it is the centre here has just published a review by. I've got it here somewhere. Ehud Rosen, go on, has just looked at the detailed links between the far left and anti-Israel activity in Britain in the Declaration of Israel. And that documents, and you see there that the leftist organisations from the Socialist Worker Party and the other groups, do not need the Israelis to have the views they have. The Israelis are useful to them, the views they have, but they are not essential. That's all, time is moving on. Wow, the Women's Report takes me back, so I have to drag my mind back. The Women's Report, yes, and I think it was one of, my judgment of it was, is one of the mistakes that Sachs made at the beginning of his tenure in raising expectations. Without, you know, if I can say, I have to, Chief Rabbi, there was an attitude about the inclusivity argument that almost he could walk on water. That you know, that this will be done and that will be done, and inevitably, one or two people, when he announced on his report, said Chief Rabbi will end in tears because you will raise expectations beyond your capacity to deliver. But the Women's Report is useful as encapsulating what is the tension of I explained the tension in terms of the politics of, you know, is he representing the community or not? But it's a tension of, the fact is, whether he's representing the community or not, whatever he's trying to do, the United Synagogue, as I said before, by its membership, is an orthodox, halachic, norm institution. Therefore, when the report came up with proposals, which within some halachic norms you might be able to accept, but with other halachic norms you're not, that created tension. And one of the issues which I didn't get into, because it's not a talk about the Chief Rabbinate, is to what extent the Chief Rabbinate, and it's a session for World Jewry, we have it in Israel even more, in spades in Israel, to what extent a organisation trying to be centrist orthodoxy is pulled to the right by the norms of more strict orthodoxy. I won't call it Haredi because that just gives a label. And I think the Women's Report, there were things implemented by the Women's Report, and things have changed to some extent. Women's participation in lay leadership and so on to a limited extent.
Can there was a presidents?
Pardon?
Can the women be presidents of synagogues?
They can't.
No.
They can't.
Cannot.
They can't. And I'm not defending it. I wish they were. I'm not. And it says anyway. I'm trying to get away in this talk from giving my personal views. I'm trying to analyse what's going on in the community. So my personal views, I am disappointed by that as well as anybody. I live here, so it's not affect me. But was it a point? Well, I'm sure the Masorti, those who were on the margins, felt that they could be more sympathetically understood in the Masorti communities moved. But I don't think it was as big. The fact, it would have been a factor, but the effect, the downturn in the United Synagogue membership was a much more secular, long-term trend of the soft underbelly moving for all sorts of reasons, not liking their rabbi, finding the services too strict, finding all sorts of things. So the women's movement has been a disappointment. There is a checklist somewhere that says certain things were achieved that I haven't got in front of me. And Sachs has said that he's not going to deal with it for the next 2.5 years, so you have to wait.
Okay, next round, but please be sure, we really believe, because otherwise we run Chaim Roth, welcome, and Malcolm Lowe. My microphone is on its way.
I would like to ask you, the letter of the Rabbis here in Israel about not renting to non-Jews and to Arabs, does the Jewish people in England would have any idea about it? Any reaction in the media? Is it only the Jewish or also the Newish, the non-Jewish reaction to that?
Leslie, you didn't mention any statistics on intermarriage, which I think would be definitely a challenge facing British Jewry. And just one quick observation, that in the census, which was the first 2001 to say, you could say if you were Jewish, it was a voluntary question. And a lot of Jews I knew, surprisingly very identified Jews and Orthodox Jews, would not answer that question because of fear of Nazism and record keeping.
Malcolm?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that something's happened in the last few weeks which may change the perspective both for British Jewry and indeed Jewry in Europe in general. Because until now, Jewish communities in Europe have been unique in the sense that all over Europe, Jewish institutions have protection, police protection, other kind of protection. Now, just recently, Islamists decided to target Coptic churches all over Europe. And the Coptic churches I've so far seen UK, France, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, maybe also Sweden, other countries. So, in other words, this is, for the first time, the situation in Jewish communities is not unique. The question is whether this is one-off or not. Now, the Copts are being targeted for events in Egypt, just like the Jewish communities are being targeted for events in Israel. Secondly, there are today in Europe hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Christians of Middle Eastern origin. So there is scope for this sort of thing to continue. I think the watershed would be if one of these organizations decides to target Roman Catholic churches in Europe. But there's something here to watch, because if, they say, the Jewish community stop being unique in this respect, the perspective both from the general public and in the communities themselves will change, and I think that that might have quite wide impact.
Thank you. There are people here who are actually from Britain and would know better than me. I don't sound if you want to identify yourself, but there has been a response to the Arab renting. I did see some drafts somewhere, the not renting to Arabs.
There were a few statements made, but it's not been big news item in England. Certainly, it's been pretty much across the board negative to the United States.
Right, so let's see, answer that. Jean, on intermarriage, no, I didn't bring figures because it's difficult to actually get figures. The latest figures, when I looked into it, were quotes saying the intermarriage rate is between 30 and 50%. And this was 205. I couldn't find any basis. I mean, I accept it, but I couldn't find any survey on which it had been done, on which it was, on which one could. But I include that in the assimilation, and indeed, Sergio Pergola, who is someone who one sort of trusts on these matters, used that figure, I think, to say that he thought British Jewry would be, I'll get my figures right now, by 2020 might be around 250, 240,000. My point is that I think the numbers are an issue, but they're not the major issue when you're still around 300 plus thousand. They become an issue when you're around 100,000, in my view. And even he said on that rate it would be 180,000 by 2080. Well, that's why I said, what's the future? You know, who knows what events in world and Jewish history are going to happen between now and 2080. So I incorporated it within my view that numbers will come down, but I think it's difficult to say. And I'm more interested in what the sort of Jewish life those either who are married in or married out are actually leading, and whether that. I think the key, another word to say, is your Jewish identity transferable? Can you? Is it sustainable? Is it transferable? Is it something that will pass to future generations? And that's what I was trying to tease out. Yes, the census. Actually, the census figure for 2001 was 263,000. The JPR, in undertaking their work on this census, took into account both Haredi and other people from other surveys they've done who didn't count the census, and that's why they got to a figure which they thought was at least 300,000. Other people say it's 350,000, but again, I think we do know 260,000 Jews, 260,000 people said they were Jewish. You've got to question whether all those actually are Jewish. When you look at the regional variation, there are Jews in some very funny places in Britain, if they're Jews. So I think 300,000 plus. That's why I said at least 300,000, and that's what I would say. And well, Malcolm knows this. You know this world. I don't know. I think the Britons have been every shul in the UK is guarded basically at the moment. Not 24 hours, but so it's possible for somebody to start attacking a shul, but not. Doesn't want to attack a shul when there's people in it. Every shul in Britain has security. Listen, if somebody comes with guns and so on, it's difficult to know what to do. But and it's not people don't have guns, but the security operation is reasonable. In fact, I don't think there's been an attack on a communal building when there's been people in it for many years. I don't think so. I don't think. But so we worry about the warning, but there's a strong infrastructure in place.
Last,
no, I'm saying that it may no longer be unique. Because you may see that churches that have
churches in the UK.
In that case, as it were, the Jews will no longer look like a strange group of people who are the only one getting attacked. But you see, the perspective on the...
Okay. We can offer them consultancy services.
Next and last round of my mom, Judge Park and Rabbi Dov.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I've studied in depth the reports you mentioned, and you're right. I think really that UK is a success story. It's very good. I will tell a few things why it's a success story. It's good management, excellent management, outstanding management regarding comparatively to other places. Very good coordination. There is a culture of dialogue among different brands, among different organizations. And there is for sure, we have space for grassroots initiative. Now I have two questions for sure. One question is short one: how you deal with the kids, with the children of intermarriage. We heard about JCOs and so on, but how do you have answers? Do you have some answers for in education, Jewish day school for school kids of Jewish non-Jewish intermarriage? And the second question is a more challenging question: is what's the impact of delegitimation and BDS and regarding Jewish engagement? And we know that in France, in Australia, in many places, Jews on campuses avoid identifying, even in over small liberal art college in America. Do you have such a thing? Do you know things like that? Do you study that? Because it's something which is going to grow, the BDS movement, more and more. It will be more and more difficult to support Israel in Europe, and how you deal with that.
Thank you for your very interesting remarks. In your replies now, you shortly mentioned universities, but could you give us a up-to-date description? To what extent is there anti-Semitism today felt in universities in England? And I'm especially referring to what to us was always to be the most astounding decisions in Cambridge and other places about boycotts declared in connection with any kind of connection with academic activities from Israel. To what extent do you think that's only a question of politics or a combination of politics or anti-Semitism? I mean, as a graduate of London University, if there's one thing that always struck me was that even if there's a conflict of interest, but freedom of speech was always the main item that was always stressed in London University and in English British universities. So the fact that suddenly in a number of in Cambridge and other universities they had decisions and that any connection with academic life from Israel should be boycotted, that was to me rather astounding. So to what extent are these dangers still existing in England?
Final question, Rabbi Marmer.
It's late, I pass.
Okay. So,
Robert, what is your first question about the children of intermarriage and how they? I didn't understand the first question.
Do you outreach to them to try to achieve? Do you integrate them?
The children of intermarriage.
Yeah. I mean the non-Jewish one.
Yeah, the liberals, to some extent, the progressive communities do, and indeed there is a Reform rabbi who specifically has a program of welcoming non-Jewish partners of Jews, either male or female, into his community and into the to the community generally. He has a program about that. The Orthodox would not do that because they would say you're either Jewish or you're not Jewish, so even that's sometimes difficult, but they would say convert by a halachic process, and then you're very welcome. But if you and I think they accept, because they're Jewish, they do accept children of women who have married out, but not the father. So it varies, as far as I'm aware, and the less Orthodox you are, the more you are more welcoming to Jews. And the liberals in particular have allowed, accept a non-Jewish father, a non-Jewish husband of a partner of a Jewish woman as a member of the synagogue and count them into membership. And would accept the children of those. So accept a Jewish father with a non-Jewish mother, their children will be accepted as members of their community. That's the key, and so that's why the numbers have gone up slightly, in my view. You asked about the impact of delegitimization and BDS, and Judge Black asked about anti-Semitism in British universities. And again, I think I used to lead British universities 5-6 years ago, and I'm glad I don't lead them now, because I think it's a very difficult and complex position. In order to understand this, it's important to distinguish between the academic life of the university and the student life. It's not to justify anything, it's just to explain why things grow up in certain ways. In Britain, the students' union, the union of students, is legally independent of the university. It doesn't mean it's, in most cases, it has its own, the university looks after it, but it has certain independence of action. So many things that take place in the name of the university are taking place in the name of the students' union, who have votes and decide they're going to boycott West Bank goods or whatever they're doing. That is not the university. Sometimes they pass resolutions to ask the university to boycott West Bank or whatever Israeli goods, but it's for the university to decide if it does that. And in my experience, I don't think any university I know has done that, or indeed has divested any university authority has done that. The university authority is doing it, and the students either doing it because they buy water for their social activities that they won't buy eating water, and making a big fuss about that. So it's important, I'm not minimizing myself, it's important to try and separate those two out in understanding what's going on. However, remember I did refer, and Judge Back is right, that there have been in recent years, because under the impact again of the Muslim students and the far left, serious inroads into free speech, and that's what the Chief Rabbi spoke out against a few weeks ago. I had in my talk, but I cut it out because of length, so I'll now reintroduce it, a section that pointed out that, and it's actually, I don't have to say much about it because the Jewish Political Studies Review published an article on it by Leslie Wagner, a piece which you can see on the website or over there on the shelves, last autumn in the last issue that we published, which pointed out that the Equalities Act, which was went through Parliament in Britain just before the general election, so is now an act, and which is about protecting minorities, has a provision that makes it, I get my legal terms absolutely right, but makes it a legal requirement on Vice Chancellors and heads of universities and colleges to protect the minority students in their, on their campus. Her view as a lawyer is that this includes protecting the rights of Jewish students, obviously, and that can be invoked in a formal legal process. And so this has been drawn to the attention of the Jewish leadership in Britain. This is all very contemporary. So, on top of what the Chief Rabbi said, I hope the Jewish community in Britain is paying attention to this. It has been drawn to their attention and investigating and taking legal advice. But it seems to me that it is possible now, it will be possible for people to take action, either Jewish students or their community on their behalf, to prevent some of these things happening. That is, however, that's a reaction. The fact is, the world has changed for the worse, and there's no doubt that Jewish students have some Jewish students in some universities have a very unhappy time. But the Jewish students have always had a happy time. I want to point out, we had a talk here about the Israel is racism UN decision 1975, which Israel and most Jewish communities ignored because they thought it was so stupid. How would anybody take it seriously? The one group that took it seriously were leftist students in the Students' Union, which started to ban Jewish student societies from operating if they supported Israel. If the Jewish student said as part of its actions, part of its principles, policies, it's Zionist, in other words, then Zionism is racism, you are racist, we don't allow racists in our student body, so you're out. And many Jewish student societies in the 80s were under threat, and indeed had to fight that threat, and had no support from the adult community in Britain, because adult communities gaily sailed on not knowing what was going on and not being interested. So Jewish students have always, in a sense, fought their corner. I used to say then in the 80s and 90s that the adults didn't know how courageous Jewish students were. And I still think it's remarkable, given that today that Jewish students and young people are bombarded by the sort of propaganda that people have spoken about in the British media and otherwise, that there's still a large, significant group of Jewish students. If you're a small group in a university out there, but if you're in LSE or Cambridge, Oxford, any of these major institutions, there still are groups of Jewish students who are willing to fight that corner and take the heat. And indeed, I always say many adults who criticise Jewish students would not themselves like to be in the position that Jewish students are in most of the time. And they need help and they need support, and I hope this legal provision will be a way of helping them. But there's no doubt that the atmosphere on British campuses for many Jewish students, and it's to do with Israel. I know generally we accept that anti-Israelism is anti-Semitism, and generally accept that, but if a Jewish student, it does spill over, but if a Jewish student wants to have a Friday night evening on egg, it may need to be protected like it's protected in the shul down the road, but I don't think people go and do anything about that. It's Israel and anything to do with Israel that's attacked, and Jewish students then defend it, so Jewish students get attacked. That is the sequence. I think it's because they defend Israel, quite rightly, that they get attacked, not because they are Jewish.
Thank you very much.